Welcome back to another episode of Cyber from the Frontlines. Today, the spotlight is on a very critical practice of threat hunting. Threat hunting, as some of you may know, is a very evolving field that requires skill, intuition, and a keen understanding of the evolving threat landscape. Joining me today to unpack this fascinating topic, I would like to welcome Lee Archinal, Senior Threat Hunting Analyst at Intel 471, uh, formerly at Cyborg. Welcome to the show, and I'm so excited with that news. When this news broke out, I was like, this looks like a not the next progression, right? Intel-driven hunting.
It was, and first of all, thanks for having me. I'm glad we finally get together. I know we touched on different professional levels as well, but it's good to be here. But yeah, like the marriage between Cyborg and Intel 471 is just so fascinating. And I don't want to spoil anything that you're going to ask in the podcast, but the fact that we threat hunting relies on a lot of threat intel. The fact
Exactly.
that we paired with a company that has such great threat intel and all this depth of knowledge, it just makes sense.
It does. And I'm so looking forward to what you guys come up with because it's, like you said, Intel drives hunting and it's really an excellent marriage, pretty much.
And I will say,
Yeah.
they Intel hasn't sent me any swag yet, so that's why I'm still rocking the Cyborg security hat.
I was chatting with Lillian Monday. I don't know if you have met with her yet, but yeah, just trying to get her on the podcast as well. But yeah, but she's really good as well. So yeah. Uh, so let's get back to the threat hunting. And before I start, I wanted to start with understanding if you can walk us through your journey in cyber, how you started and where you are at now. Would be nice to understand that as well.
Absolutely. So I actually had a very crazy and unexpected journey into information technology, the field in general. So I joined the military out of high school, and I didn't want to go in and get the normal experience where, I wanted to kind of make it so that I would have a job afterwards that taught me something. I want to continue learning. So when I joined the military, I was slotted to be what they called a 94 Foxtrot, and I think the official title was a computer system repair. So almost like fixing night vision goggles. Basically, what it summed up to was anything electronic, they'll teach me how to fix. And I was like, cool, I can do that. And I went through basic training, went through my AIT course, which is the job training. Then I went to airborne school, which was fun. But then I landed in the 75th Ranger Regiment, which is what the unit I was assigned to, which is actually where I met Scott Pulley, who you'll be discussing or you'll be interviewing later on.
Yeah.
Um, I got to our unit at the 75th Ranger Regiment, and they're like, we don't do that here. Like, we're going to teach you to do something else. And I was like, oh, what are you going to teach me? And you're going to be a communicator. I was like, okay, radios. I've learned to fix radios. Now let's make them work, which was cool. Then they're like, that's not it. You're going to work with some Cisco routers and switches. I was like, what? Like, I don't even, what is this thing here? And basically, they're like, they let computers talk. And I'm looking at this thing. I'm like, I've never seen something like this before in my life. How does it make computers talk? And once I started learning the puzzle that is switches, routers, and the network, like blew my mind. I was like, this is awesome. Like, you mean I can specifically block off certain computers and devices and say, don't talk to these. And I can control that. And that just like did it for me. I love that puzzle. And then I got my Net Plus, I got my Security Plus, and I got a CCNA all through while in the military, which I feel like is a good progression. And honestly, I would recommend that to anyone that's looking to get into cybersecurity. But then I was getting out of the military, and Scott, beat me out. So he left before I did. He went. I'm not going to spoil his story, but he calls me up, and I was like, "Hey, I'm getting out," and he was like, "Come be a cybersecurity guy." I was like, "No, I'm a network guy. You trained me." I was like, "You trained me in networking." I was like, I'm a network guy." He's like, "No, no, come be a cybersecurity guy." I was like, "All right." I was like, "I trust you." pulled me into a regional energy company where I was a SOC analyst for 4 years, and those 4 years were just great. It was panic, it was stress because I was drinking from a fire hose, but I found Sysmon. I read some great articles that sent me on this path, which was the one I always call out is the JP or the Japan CERT tool analysis spreadsheet, which was just a report on living off what I didn't know back then, but what is called now living off land binaries. And they just turned on all the logging, all the auditing they could. And they're like, here's the log sources that appear whenever these are run, just normally. And I was like, what are these? And I'm a very literal person and visual person. So understanding that there's evidence in event logs that I can see and I can read, I was like, wow, this is great. So I got into Sysmon. I actually deployed it in our environment while we were there, or started working through it. And then I left, went to a bank. I was a lead SOC analyst there. But then I was still like, man, I really want to get into or make it better. How can I look for adversaries in a better way? How can I find malicious activity that's not a normal detection or alert? And then I found Cyborg, and they were like, we are threat hunting, and I was like, what is that? And I started asking, actually Eric Sigmund. I hit him up on LinkedIn. I was like, what is this? Tell me about your company. And then from there, the story was like, I just did a lot of cool stuff at Cyborg. The leadership there was like, how are you gonna, or what do you want to do? And I told them, and they said, let's direct this so it's beneficial to the company. I did. I built, or I helped build out the customer success program over there before some guys like Jeff came on. But I built training for our customers, and then finally I was like, well, what if I try to submit training to Black Hat? Because the first Black Hat I went into, I was like, how do we make Cyborg's name bigger? How do we get on those posters? How do we do this? And my manager at the time, Brandon, told me, he was like, hey, you either got to give a talk or give a training or pay a lot of money. I was like, well, I'm probably not going to do either of those or any of those. I was like, but once I built the training for the customers, I was like, what if we submit this to Black Hat? And they let us in the first time. And I was like, wow. And I mean, it's just a lot of fun. It's a lot of freedom to work. And it's just amazing that I've been here. And then Intel 471 acquiring us is just like the start of another great adventure. And I apologize, I was probably very long-winded, but it's just been a amazing journey with a lot of unexpected stuff. But it's never been bad. So.
Fascinating. I look at your posts on LinkedIn as well because I see your workshops, which I want to attend as well. Unfortunately, during that time, there always is a conflict. But I look at the videos; they are really good, and I would encourage everybody to check them out, attend those workshops, as well as you mentioned Black Hat, the training, especially what you talk about, right? Threat hunting is not ISC search. I think a lot of people have this misconception of threat hunting as, oh, okay, yeah, we'll go and look for ISCs. Just that is not threat hunting. So, yeah. So encourage everybody to go and check those workshops as well. If you can go to Black Hat, please do attend that. That's really good. So on that note, let's just talk about what exactly is threat hunting and how it differs from traditional cybersecurity approaches.
So, and now I'll start with like what's sort of like the traditional approach now. And as we speak, I'm sure companies are adapting threat hunting processes and programs. So this might not be the norm anymore. Hopefully it's not. But when I first started in a SOC, it was you had all your security devices and you had static alerts and detections that analysts would triage. So you waited for something to pop. You took a look at it, you investigated it, and you said, hey, this is a false positive, or no, this is a true incident and it's happening right now. Now, what threat hunting is and how it differs from that approach is that it's kind of solving the same problem, just in a different way. And what we really like to call out is that threat hunting is a proactive and hypothesis-based procedure or process. we like to hit on those two big notes is because one, proactive, we're looking for the adversary before they reach those objectives or goals that normally we have either security devices to stop or alerts and detections to trigger on as well. But really, what threat hunting helps us do is find the activity in the behaviors or the tactics, techniques, or procedures that are earlier on in the attack chain, like lateral movement, privilege escalation, execution, persistence, and so on. Now, what we like to do is also say it's a hypothesis-driven process, which is poses problems, but if you have leadership that understands what you're talking about, the idea is and we actually refer to it like the scientific method. We say, I think this activity is happening in my environment based off of resources, intel, reports, you name it. But we're going to go look for it because we think this, this could be happening right now. So you take an idea, you research it based on, historic artifacts, and you dive into your environment and say, what would this look like in my environment? And you go through that whole tuning process, log analysis, but you're searching and searching and searching, which could be time consuming and could cause problems if you don't have the right leadership or understanding. But that's the whole idea behind threat hunting is we're going out first to try and find it versus waiting for a trap to snapshot, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. Couldn't agree more. And just to add on to that, you mentioned understanding. One of the prerequisites I also found out was as you go along building this hunting framework, you tend to understand a lot about what is normal in your organization. It may not be the case when you start, but that's the whole idea because a lot of these adversaries are, like I mentioned, living of the land binaries are using the same things that our guys are also using. So yeah, that's a pretty good.
There's always the possibility that they bypass an alert or detection because you accounted for a bunch of parameters or you accounted for all this, but you forgot the one thing and they saw that and moved down. Exactly. Lots of reasons to threat hunt.
Exactly. So this ties nicely into the next one as well. What are the key objectives and benefits of implementing a threat hunting program within an organization?
So the keys and objective, or the main key objectives, is to ultimately reduce the dwell time of the adversary within your environment. From the malicious perspective, you want to find that adversary as soon or as early on in the attack chain as possible. And if you are actively threat hunting, then you give yourself a better chance than them hitting a static alert or detection again and triggering something. That means they've been there for a while. They may have the right privileges that they need. Something may just be stopping them. But if you find them early on, say, execution, discovery, persistence, those tactics, that's a lot better than finding or responding to an alert that says, hey, a bunch of files are being encrypted. Now, some of the benefits, like you said, is really learning your environment. From a SOC analyst perspective, I did learn about my environment, about like what are false positives but when you go threat hunting, and they're structured and unstructured, but that might be another question. But if you're looking at the data and you are actively having to weed out false positives and say, okay, I have all this data, I ran this threat hunt, there's a lot more than I expected. What is actually normal in my environment? What is expected activity, and how can we tune this out? By going through that, you start to have to almost dissect the data and say, all right, this process chain from this individual at this time on this day every week, that's normal. I know it looks malicious, but that person's just backing up files or deleting stuff or clearing room, whatever the case may be. So that at first, just because it was returned from a threat hunt, looking at the data, you could say, well, that's expected, so we're going to remove that. And as you slowly peel back what's normal and you're learning and hopefully documenting, you start to realize like this is all expected activity. We can turn a blind eye to it and boom, what we have left is either suspicious or malicious. And I always like to say suspicious because there's always shadow IT or just people being people and going the convenient route or the easy route, right? If they do have admin privileges, maybe they're opening everything up as an admin, which ignoring best practices, but it's just easier that way. So those are the things you learn. But yeah, it's a lot of fun. I'll say that.
Yeah, I agree. I yeah, I started working on threat hunting like I would say 3, 4 years back, and I really enjoy it, especially because it's every day is different, man.
Oh
Like
yeah.
so many different ways you have this evolving threat landscape, and every day there's something new you can do. And like you said, you learn a lot as you go along. You learn about your environment, and things like that. So that's pretty cool. Um, so we initially talked about intelligence-driven hunting. So for folks who don't know that, what role does threat intel play in an effective threat hunting program?
So threat intelligence is almost like the source of threat hunting. Um, or I should say structured threat hunting. The idea with structured threat hunting is that you are looking at past reports, you are looking at or whatever timely intel that you have, whether that be open source or if you do have an intel provider like Intel 471, then you have access to this real time or almost real time data. Now, what that allows you to do is say you're an industry, say you are in banking, right? There are certain threat actors that always go for banking industries. So you could say, well, what are they currently doing? What TTPs are they currently doing? What behaviors are they exhibiting? What are the actions that they're performing in their attacks? Once you have an idea of, or a general idea of what each attack normally looks like, you can take that knowledge and apply it to your environment. And once again, saying, all right, this is what their attacks looked like in the past. What does it look like in my environment? Is there, because once again, using living off the land binaries that exist in your environment, or I guess I should say they abuse living off the land binaries in your environment, you're going to have a lot of results, especially if you're looking for Windows Command Shell or like PowerShell. I mean, that's a lot of noise. But if you have an idea of what they've done in the past, you can apply that to what you're looking for now and give you a step forward and almost the advantage in a threat hunt. So having timely, active, or and really good threat intel really helps you prioritize your threat hunting program, which is a big issue for a lot of organizations, especially if they're just standing up a threat hunt program. They're like, well, where do we start? It's like, well, what's your threat landscape look like? Well, what are you worried about? We ask these things the question, or we ask these questions all the time to customers, so we can get an idea so that we can tailor things to them. But once again, basing all that off of intel, you now have a better idea of where to start your threat hunting.
Oh yeah, definitely. And like you said, it has to be relevant to your organization. We could be hunting anything, but you have to prioritize and focus on what is relevant to us, essentially.
Yeah. Now, unfortunately, there are those behaviors that are used by and I'll just say like the general APTs, the things that everyone uses, like PowerShell encoded commands or gaining persistence from the auto run registry key. Like I've seen that so many times. At the point, sometimes you're like, well, are we really searching for the people we thought? It's like, well, it depends, but it's all good.
Nice. So I had a follow-up question. You mentioned some of these LOLPs, living of the land binaries like PowerShell. You see a lot of false positives, a lot of noise. How do you deal with that? How do you differentiate what is normal activity against what could be malicious?
So this relies a lot on internal knowledge or what's commonly referred to as like tribal knowledge in organizations. From the outside in, we can't really determine that. Some of the thing, and that's something we help our customers with. We've actually designed some specific queries that will help us enumerate that activity. And then when they run it and they say, here's our results, we kind of work them through the process of like just looking at things. Like the first thing I always look for is directories, right? Like, especially if you're living off the land binaries. If you're looking for PowerShell running out of the normal PowerShell or expected PowerShell directory, what if you see it running out of downloads or app data local or users public? Immediately, that's like a big red flag, and you're like, that's not good. So reading the data and like working through just like a first scan is always like the first step. Does anything obvious stand out? Then I like to pivot towards, you could go different ways, right? You could say, well, are there any like files being created? Or do we see registry keys? If we're looking at like process create information with command line arguments and parent command line arguments, you start looking at those and say, well, are they modifying any registry keys? Are they reaching out to any external IPs? Some other things like that. Or one thing I really like to do also is look for syswhile64 execution. So the living off the land binaries that are 32-bit running in a 64-bit machine will always show up in C Windows syswhile64 versus system32 directory. Now, what I've learned is that a lot of organizations have both in their infrastructure, so that's not a quick win anymore, but it does help as well, especially if you know a certain machine, or so if you do see a certain machine that's 32-bit, and you're like, okay, that's expected, but if it's a 64-bit machine, it could be a little suspicious. And then from there, we look at users. Is there anything like running at NT authority system? Like, is there anything that shouldn't be? Are there any processes that this doesn't make sense? Like one thing I always like to use in my workshop is Notepad. I always like to process inject in a Notepad because it allows me to, and it gives me privileges. So if you see Notepad spawning different processes, or if you see SVC host, which is a common tactic, spawning different processes, look into that. Start chaining it together. Okay, when SVC host was the parent, who was the child? Now, let's take a step backwards. What did it look like when SVC host was the child process? So now we identify who the parent was, and you can start taking like steps back and possibly, like I said, find out like who or what process injected itself into that. There's a lot of different ways, but it always is a lot of fun whenever we get a customer that's willing to let us sit down and kind of sift through their data and do that. It really is always a good time.
Nice. I wanted to understand more about the process of conducting a threat hunt. If you could walk us through from start to finish how it looks like, what is the life cycle like?
Once again, focusing on prioritization. We try to figure out what are we going to look for, certain APD group, malware, or just new TTPs and behaviors. So first, we got to pick, or I always like to say I cast a wide net. I get very general with my hypothesis, and that normally aligns with the MITRE ATT&CK matrix. So I'll say execution, persistence, whatever the case may be. So I start with, or let's just say persistence in this case. Then, of course, on the MITRE ATT&CK matrix, there's a bunch of techniques, which are a little more specific than just persistence. So they tell you how they gain persistence. And then if there's a sub-technique, we dive even deeper into that. So we want to get as specific with our hypothesis as possible. That way there is a lot less variables that we have at hand that could really either A, return a lot of data, or B, just add so much time in the research process. Because after we create our hypothesis, then we go and research. And if we're looking at 10 different tools in a single hypothesis, that's 10 different sets of documentation at a minimum. And you can see how that just piles up. The time and effort is now just huge. And at that point, you're doing more, or you're spending more time researching and prepping for the threat hunt than you are threat hunting. So getting very specific. Then we like to build a query to really figure out what values we're looking at and what fields we're looking in. And when I talk about a query, it's whatever query language in whatever SIM or security information event management tool or endpoint detection and response tool or EDR. Normally that's where we operate. So we think we have to apply what tool we're using. We have to apply the right syntax. But then we have this query that we say, okay, now that we're looking for persistence and we're looking for these values and this technique, let's take a look into our environment. And that's where we step into the data. That's where all those false positives start coming back. Because it is, I mean, if going back to the specific example I used earlier with the auto run registry key, it's used by a lot of adversaries, but it's also used by legitimate organizations. Say you have a set of programs and applications that you want to run whenever a certain user logs on. So whatever role they have, is it finance? Is it HR? Is it help desk? Is it server admin? Whatever the case may be, they all have the tools that they use. So if you have those boot up whenever they log in, you're saving time. So that's a legitimate application. Now, that capability exists, so the adversary can say, well, you know what? I'm going to put my malware in that auto run registry key location, and it's going to fire up every time that user logs on. So now I have repeatable access to it. And that's where, once again, that tribal knowledge comes in. You have to go through all those registry keys that have been modified or all the registry keys that you have and say, okay, let's look for tools that we know exist. AnyDesk, I know that's abused a lot, but that's also used in a bunch of organizations. Or other tools like that, like what was the other one? TeamViewer. Those show up because they're in legitimate environments, but adversaries are also abusing those tools for their capabilities. So you have to start looking at those different values. You got to see when they're searching. And then one of the easiest ways, I should say, in theory, one of the easiest ways is you can tie these changes to a documented and approved change. So do we have a new user that came on that is filling this, this server admin role? And then, so yeah, they had to build a computer and modify the registry key so it's fit for them. Or is this completely not related to any activity that is expected, or a change, or a new hire, or someone leaving the organization? So you got to start asking all these questions. But then from there, and I wish I could tell you where the end is, because we're not always sure. Like we never, sometimes we'll find malicious activity, and then you escalate it to whoever incident response team is, or if you are the incident response team as well. But if it ends up being expected activity or like a non-finding, and we never say no findings because there's always an outcome. You always learn something more about your environment. You always learn how something operates differently.
Right.
But there's always a finding. But if it's in that non-finding, or I should say non-malicious finding group, then that's where you document it. That's where you can explain things later on to your team, your manager, upper management, or new hires, or if people, if they're looking at a report and say, what happened with that incident? You could say, well, you know what? This was just, we had 10 new hires on the same day for the same role, and all these changes were made. And that's what it was. So there's a lot of different outcomes for a threat hunt. So I really wish I could say that we find the bad guy every time. But
yeah, that's exactly where my head is as well, because not that may be occasional, but most of the time I found threat hunt helps in augmenting detection capabilities as well. So many times as well. So that's a huge value add for any organization if a threat hunt program helps you in augmenting your detection capabilities. That's pretty cool then.
absolutely, because and I keep talking about time spent on tuning and removing false positives. Well, if you have a thought or that hypothesis, and you start working it through the threat hunting process, and you document all these false positives, and then all of a sudden you have this query that's left that says, okay, well, now that we're getting no data returned because we know what's expected, we know how our environment works, what would that leave? And then another part of the process that I actually haven't even touched yet was emulation.
Well,
Being able to emulate or the activity that you're looking for,
yeah.
validate your query works to validate that you're in the right track. That's a good addition to the process. So if you have no results left because you tuned out what all the things you expected, and you're like, all right, well, I'm gonna emulate a bad guy, and you perform that task, you modify that auto run registry key, and then you find it, you say, hey, we just threat hunted our way to a detection. And that's where you can hand it off to like the SOC or the detection engineering team if there is one, and say, could you just run this through your process too? But this is what we came up with. Of course, hand them all the documentation, not physically anymore. I guess these days you just send them a bunch of Excel spreadsheets. But then you have that, like you said, detection, and you've improved your security posture and hopefully close or bridge that gap of visibility.
Yeah, oh yeah. Emulation, yeah, definitely helps a lot if you have a purple team, or you can pretty much use Atomic Red team has a pretty good that's a pretty good resource as well if you want to.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, perfect. So I want to understand for organizations that are looking to establish a threat hunting program, what are some of the essential tools or technologies they should consider implementing apart from the human aspect of it?
Oh, apart from the human aspect, okay, we're not even gonna mess with that, because that's a whole
Oh yeah.
talk on itself. So tools, um, I always like to recommend. Well, if you're a small medium business, I feel like the best quick wins happen if you introduce an EDR into your environment. Um, the reason for that is because if you bring in a SIM, you're relying on your knowledge or your team's knowledge of security practices to configure the SIM to ingest logs that you think are necessary. Now, and this isn't really against anyone, but a lot of the small to medium businesses that need security quick isn't the type of organization that has a full staffed IT security team. Who understand auditing, who understands incident response. Normally, you have like that one guy that can do it all at a level to keep your business running. So introducing an EDR that's already pre-configured to audit things, or it has visibility into processes, files being created, registry keys being modified, it's built to go. So in introducing that into your environment, I think is a quick win from a threat hunting perspective. I'm not talking about basic security practices. But if you want to start threat hunting, get that EDR in there, learn the language of it, see what events, see what evidence you have. All that information is valuable. So then you can start going down the process of, now that I have these events, now that I have this visibility and this knowledge, I can start looking for things. For the larger organizations, I recommend both an EDR and a SIM. The reason for this is that small to medium business, maybe they'll deploy like 10, 20 agents, right? So that EDR is really covering 20 things, and that's not a lot of data, not a lot of things to look at. And you're mainly concerned of like novelty now. Big organizations that can tend to be targeted by the APT group, so the more sophisticated people. Get that EDR in there, and then so you have that baseline of coverage, and then use your SIM to bridge the gap or close the gap of visibility that you don't have. Now, it's not a knock on EDRs. I mean, I use plenty of them day to day. But once again, they're more of a black box. They're already pre-configured and designed to have their certain visibility. So they only have a limited visibility, which is still a lot because there's a lot of event logs in there. There's a lot of information. But what you can do is with your SIM, if you're in that organization, or not even a big organization, but if you can afford it, you can start looking at other log sources that you can start ingesting that add value. Like a lot of the Kerberos stuff that native Windows logging gathers, not normally looked at from EDRs. So there's that visibility gap, and then of course EDRs they track network connections and stuff. But if you want your firewalls, if you want your IPSs, if you want your other security devices reporting to your SIEM, you can do that. You can ingest whatever you want. So by being able to cover those bases of saying, all right, we got firewall logs, we got DNS, we got proxy, DC logs, all that lives in the SIEM. EDR logging is that's the EDR. But if you are looking at certain things or looking for certain information that the EDR doesn't cover, then you can configure your environment to report that to the SIEM. So it's like a balancing act. It's pretty time consuming too, because you got to sit there and say, all right, well, let's compare coverage and let's compare. And then normally what that conversation alludes to is, oh, we need a bigger license to ingest more data into our SIEM, which is going to cost more money. And then that whole conversation starts, which I'm glad I'm not a part of. So.
No, that's good. That's good. So from a human perspective, we talked about tools and technologies. So purely from a threat hunter perspective, what are the common challenges that one should expect, and how do we address those?
From the human aspect, so one of the problems, or I guess I haven't had this issue, but talking to a lot of community members, some of the problems they or struggles they come across is leadership or teammates that say threat hunting is a buzzword nowadays. The organization says, I want to threat hunt, we're going to threat hunt. And then you ask, okay, how are we going to do that? And they're like, here's how we're going to do it. We're going to take all the IOCs from our threat intel platform, and we're going to create a query within a minute, and we're going to scan our environment. And while that's a good start, and it's not threat hunting, and I apologize if that angers people, but dealing with IOCs is not threat hunting because they're a point-in-time artifact that file hashes, IPs, file names, domain names, they can all change from campaign to campaign or from day to day. Or if it's a polymorphic piece of malware, if it copies itself and renames itself in your environment, there could be 100 different copies of it, but it has the same name or a different name. So searching on IOCs gives you a quick win if you find one and say, oh, I know that's a malicious hash. Let's investigate that. But from a threat hunting perspective, we're not trying to use variables like IOCs. We're trying to use the constant artifacts, like, once again, the registry keys that have certain capabilities or different protocols that can be abused, like RDP, those types of things. And if your upper management or organization doesn't understand that, and if they treat threat hunting like a binary process where A, you either find a malicious activity, or B, you don't, and then B being the don't, a lot of times you don't find that malicious activity, but you're, once again, going back to that idea of there's never a no finding, there's all these different non-malicious findings. If they don't understand that's an outcome, or if that's even part of threat hunting, then that program might stop really quickly because threat hunting is time consuming. It involves normally a lot of money with these tools. So if they find it as a fruitless effort, then they might just, remove that completely. And I guess another struggle is just the constantly changing tactics, techniques, and procedures of the adversary. Because as soon as we're like, hey, check this out, we found a fix for this, they're like, they're paying attention too. The bad guys pay attention. They read the intel reports that we do, and then they adapt. They change their ways. So because as soon as we're looking this way and they figure that out, they're going to go the another way. And I believe this what we saw in a good example of this whenever who was it? Was it Mandiant that promoted an APT group or sandworm to APT 44, was it?
Yeah, yeah. Recently,
Yeah, just recently. And I think I saw on Twitter someone, a Russian actor, or I shouldn't say Russian actor, but someone from Russia reported on it and said, "Hey, look at the news, guys!" And like they're like, "Look how proud we are." And I knew that happened, but seeing it somewhere, you're just like, "Oh,
yeah.
like they're really paying attention."
Oh yeah.
So that's another struggle with the adversary learning what we do.
Oh yeah, definitely. It's constantly evolving, adding new stuff. So yeah, uh,
Yeah.
that's true. Uh, so in terms of say, if we look into the future 5 years from now, where do you envision threat hunting? What would the role of threat hunting be at that point of time? What do you anticipate any changes or anything that shapes this field?
I feel like with more technology being created for good and bad, for security reasons, for operation reasons, that we're just going to continue or going to have to continue to adapt our processes.
Mm.
Um, and really, our knowledge is going to have to grow. There are going to be new log sources out there. I mean, think about the cloud. We always, whenever the cloud happened, that's a whole new set of logs. That's a whole new understanding of that infrastructure. And what now we have like zero trust. We have open AI or all these language or large language models that are coming out. So now we have to adapt and figure out how can we
Yeah,
um, how can we learn these new technologies? How can we understand them? How can we audit them and get that log trail? And really understand what, once again, going back to the age old, learning what normal is. Um, but I feel like it's going to be the same process. Just like the scientific method hasn't changed since, I don't know, it's been created, or at least I learned it in elementary school.
mm,
That process can still remain consistent. I think that will really stand the test of time. Because if you're basing it off a hypothesis, it's always going to be a hypothesis. It's just going to be different research. It's going to
mm.
be different ideas where that threat hunting is happening. So I think it might get tougher because new technologies. It might be more time consuming. It's going to continue to stay tough because adversaries are going to continue to change their TTPs and behaviors. But I don't feel that it's going to go away. Just like a security operations center, I don't think that'll go away because you always need that
Right.
human element in there to make the decision. I don't care how smart your AI or your machine learning is, you need that human to be able to say, yes, this is malicious, or no, it's not. And I believe, and I could be wrong here, but I think it was from an IBM manual from years ago, from like the 60s or something, that said, and I'm going to paraphrase because I don't remember the quote specifically, but it said like a computer should never be able to be allowed to make a decision because you can never put a computer on trial. So if we ever go closer and closer to that, where it's like, well, we're making this is making all the decisions, we need to take a step back and realize that's not the case. Like we need to start, getting back on that path.
Oh yeah, definitely. That sounds scarier, like Skynet, like Terminator
Yeah,
series.
right.
It's crazy.
As soon as that happens, I'm moving to the woods. I'm buying a couple acres and living off the land.
Yeah.
For real, not binaries.
So finally, I had one more question for you. What advice would you offer to aspiring threat hunters or any cybersecurity person, professional who wants to learn more about cyber threat hunting or wants to uh, work in this field?
So, and I get this question a lot from the community. First, I know I keep mentioning the community, but I do like to be active in it. I like to be sharing my knowledge. My biggest goal, I'm blessed to be a cyborg has supported me, and now I'm sure Intel 471 will support me. But the idea, because they said their culture is a lot about community as well, and that's why we're like, once again, the perfect fit.
Yeah.
Um, I'm always trying to be the teacher I wish I had when I was a day one SOC analyst. I'm trying to impart enough knowledge that you can be like use without trying to have to learn everything at one time. So whenever I get these questions, I normally say, and I know there's a million routes to threat hunting, but I always like to say get your net or don't get your net plus, study network plus, study the security plus, because that is the foundation, like foundation knowledge you need to understand how computers communicate or network devices communicate. And if you can understand that and that's your foundation, then you have an operation or you have the foundation of operations where you're saying, how can I make this work and is it working? And you know, of course, yes or no. Then you study security plus. And if you get the certifications, that's a bonus. But security takes all that foundation knowledge and says, well, here's how you make sure it's working in the right way. And that's the whole security lens. From there, I always recommend, and if the resources are out there, stand up a home lab. Because that's honestly what I did. I took an old server that a buddy gave me. I put Windows Server on it. I had the Elastic Stack back in the day. I had a Windows VM that I put Sysmon on, which I forgot to plug when you asked about tools and technology. I always, always, always recommend Sysmon because it's free. It's free. It just takes time to configure and weed out the noise. But mess around with things, like break things. I understand you don't want to do that on your your personal computer. You don't want to go to downloading stuff from Russia. But if you can create a VM or stand up a malware lab, that's where you really learn because you can detonate malware in a controlled environment that's not going to damage anything. You can blow your VM away, build it back up, and you're back to the one. But log it. Look at those logs. Look at the evidence. Look at the things that happen. And then you start learning. And then you can start thinking about, well, what if I try to detect at this point? Or what if I try to build a hunt? Or I saw this happen. What other events happened around it? That's always fun. Also, I guess a personal plug here, and you mentioned it earlier. We do have a workshop coming up on May 15th, where it's called Left of Boom. It's talking about TTPs and behaviors of ransomware or common ransomware attacks. Because going through all the reports, going through all the information, we found that there's a certain number of TTPs that behaviors that are exhibited before the ransomware is detonated.
Oh yeah.
So we're trying to capture that idea so that once again you're not alerting on, oh, ransomware is detonated.
Right.
Look for these things.
I have registered for that as well. Hopefully, this time, fingers crossed, no meeting at that time, but we'll see.
Well, it's recorded.
Yeah, it's recorded, so perfect.
And I'll shoot you the link, but we have a link to Cyborg Security's page
Right.
that had all our previous workshops as well. What students get is an OVA. So if they have VirtualBox, they get the image that they're looking for. It gives you an Elastic instance, so you can use the Elastic SIM, and it gives you a log file so that you can actually look at malicious activity, which I whipped up. But you can start messing around with it and start playing with the tool and learning from it.
Right.
And I always recommend that as well. Not as I mean, it's kind of like a shameless plug, but that's the exact reason we created it, was to be those teachers and those guides to the community that we wanted as young threat hunters, as young SOC analysts, and so on.
Awesome.
And always stay curious. Always question things, and like, if you see an event log, investigate it. I don't care if you find a false positive. Investigate it. Have fun with it.
Yeah, great advice.
Thanks.
Pretty cool. And there you have it, folks. Deep dive into the world of threat hunting with our fantastic guest, Lee Archinal. Thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your insights. Very, very valuable. And to our listeners, we hope you found this discussion as enlightening as I did. So thank you, Lee.
Thanks again for having me. This is a wonderful opportunity.
Awesome. Thanks.